こんにちは、皆さん。ようこそへ。今日はだけ英語で喋ります。でも、中山由紀子さんは、このスライドを翻訳しました。そして読めると思います。Today's topic is effective missing element arguments at the USPTO. The situation that we're trying to address today is that sometimes examiners fully or partially maintain a rejection, even when a previously filed claim amendment should overcome the rejection. In this situation, the applicant has already paid the attorney's service fee for amending the claims, so a failure to overcome that rejection is a waste of money. もったいない. This failure is a form of prosecution debt. And of course, we'll discuss what the interest payments on this prosecution debt are. If you've been following me for a while, you should be familiar with this concept. So why do examiners maintain these rejections? Well, actually, we need to begin with what happens when an examiner receives your amendment. In that case, she wonders, in order, first, can I allow this claim so I can receive my counts in an efficient manner? Counts are a measure of productivity. They're also a 30 to 60 minute seminar on their own. We're not going to get into counts today, other than, again, they measure productivity. Niban. Can I merely interpret and reject the amended claim in view of my current references so that I do not need to conduct another search? Right? It's a lot easier for the examiner to just maintain the current rejection. And only if that is not the case does the examiner consider, do I need to search for another reference to reject the claim? That is the least preferred course of action. This isn't true of just the USPTO. I've given this seminar to a former Japan Patent Office examiner, and he said that they're basically the same as well. And actually, well, there's more to. I've given it at a higher level than that, even in terms of the JPO. So if the examiner cannot allow the claims, he would prefer to maintain the rejection. Okay. The reason is that it's less work to argue against an applicant's argument than to do another search. Therefore, American examiners are more interested in a time-efficient, fair rejection than a time-inefficient, good rejection. The European Patent Office, for example, issues what, many people consider to be the best office actions in the world, but they're also, relatively inefficient, let's say. European prosecution tends to take a while. At the USPTO, we're not trying to be unfair, but we are trying to be time efficient. And so, I think it's fair to say that the quality of the office actions is not as high as in Europe, maybe, but that's not our goal. Our goal is to, keep prosecution moving at a faster pace. And because of this time pressure, your examiner might not have the technical understanding or the time necessary. Well, because of the time pressure, they might not have the time necessary to determine whether a claim amendment overcomes the previously applied references. There's also a lot of examiners at the USPTO examining cases outside of the area in which they applied or for the job, or outside their area of study. So sometimes they do lack the technical understanding. And therefore, your examiner might not have the time to determine whether a claim amendment makes a previous rejection unfair. Okay. This is actually quite common. They just, they find some references. They're not really sure if the if the references teach the subject matter of the claims, but they leave it to the applicant to explain that difference. It's very common. Um, and again, sometimes they can't determine if the amendment does make that rejection unfair. And this typically occurs in difficult technologies like artificial intelligence or intense mathematics, or in the case of foreign language references, right? Sometimes we're reading in machine translation. Sometimes we are using cases that may not, prior art references that may not have been translated very well, either because they're a machine or a human. And therefore, when we supply arguments to the USPTO, the goal of our written remarks is there's three of them. The first is to convince the examiner that he cannot maintain the current rejection. The second one is that this must be done in a time-efficient manner. And if necessary, we explain the references to the examiner. Okay, because sometimes we know they don't really know what their references teach, and therefore they don't know whether the rejection is bad or not after the amendment. So first I have to kind of introduce what are some different common attorney argument styles. Um, and then we're going to go through today's case study uh, involving what the applicant did and then what my alternative approach would be. So there are three main attorney argument styles, and we'll talk about what these are in a moment. The first one is to argue everything. The second one is to argue nothing. And there's a special case here where I refer to it as just arguing only the record. This is the evidentiary record. This is the evidence that's already present in the application. And then the third style is arguing minimally, is how I think of it, but really it's more like arguing effectively. Um, Again, this was presented to a former JPO examiner as well, and he agrees that this is common at the JPO as well. Um, though the relative percentages as to, how many attorneys argue pursue each of these styles is a little bit different. So arguing everything. These attorneys will argue the office action interpretations of several features of the independent claim. They argue everything, but the main distinguishing feature here is the interpretations that are in the office action rather than, the actual subject matter of the claims, rather than the subject matter of the references. Um, it's really going to focus on like, well, the office action relied on this part, but that doesn't teach, that's totally different. And then they get into this whole technical analysis rather than like kind of um, constructing how these structures are then used elsewhere in the claim. These attorneys also typically argue several dependent claims. Uh, their remarks section will probably include the entire claim, if not several other claims as well. Again, there's going to be lengthy citations to the office action, especially. They really get upset about what the examiner says. And then, of course, some citations to the references as well. And therefore, the remarks section will be around 20 pages. These are lengthy arguments, and they do create a lot of estoppel. Um, Examiners will say things like, look, these remarks are too long. I'm not going to read them, and I'm just going. They don't really talk about what my references show. They don't really talk about how the claim's different, and therefore they just maintain the rejection. You don't have to take my word for it. I was never an examiner, but I can tell you that, attorneys and examiners talk. We kind of complain to each other after our interviews are conducted, and this is what I've heard from them. Sometimes I'm able to talk to applicants that work with these types of attorneys, and they will say things like those attorneys are paid hourly, which is not a surprise. Some attorneys pursue a different approach. They argue nothing. They make no substantive discussion about the reference. There's just a statement like no cited reference includes the elements of amended claim one. I do want to make the point here that this is actually a strategy I sometimes file or follow. Um, Not often, usually for uh well, for a couple of reasons, really. So one reason is that if you conduct an interview with the examiner and the examiner agrees that the amended claim overcomes the rejection, this is a perfect response. This is the best possible response because you already have an agreement that the claim distinguishes. Um, Sometimes it's for time-related issues. You know, applicants might not pay for a lot of attorney time. That's fine. If I'm confident in my claim overcoming, I will sometimes use this. But the trick is knowing that it will work, because frequently it doesn't. Um, and that's why it gets overused. So I do it much more sparingly than I used to. I used to do it a lot. There are plenty of attorneys that still continue to do this to this day. These attorneys, in their remarks sections, typically include the entire claim, none of the claim, or only the amended portion. When I do it, I edit my claim. The point is that this is a speed concern, right? They don't want to create any estoppel, and the remarks sections are typically very short, less than 3 pages, unless we have something long like a eligibility rejection. The main advantage here for the applicant is that there's no estoppel. You're not arguing anything. But again, sometimes the strategy does not work, and your examiner will say that the rejection still seems fair, and they maintain the current rejection. You haven't really explained to the examiner how it's different. And when I've done this for applicants, it's typically because I'm operating on a flat fee basis. And certainly lots of other attorneys have made it clear that they do it too for the same reason. There's kind of a special case here where um, I think this is whatever. You can have your own opinion about it. There is a special case of arguing nothing in which attorneys copy and paste large sections of text but make no explanation. That's really the focus here, is this idea of copying and pasting, right? It's not that the attorneys aren't including anything, it's that they're not really adding anything to the discussion, right? If you copy and paste a portion of the office action, well, it said the same thing in the original office action. If you copy and paste a portion of the reference that the examiner already clearly relied on, then the examiner already knows that. There's no editing to make it clearer. There's no context given for why that portion's being copied and pasted. There's no distinctions that are being drawn. It's literally just copying and pasting portions of text. It's best illustrated by an example. Today's case study is like this. The remarks section will typically include the entire claim, and therefore the remarks section looks longer than if they argue nothing. It therefore looks like they've done more work, but in my view, they've done little work because editing and providing context and providing explanation would take much longer. Because all of this evidence is already in the file wrapper, it already exists, the examiner's already considered it, there's basically no estoppel, but your examiner says, look, I already know that, and they maintain the rejection. Especially this is particularly important when they can't determine whether your amendment has overcome the previous rejection. And again, having spoken to people, applicants in this situation, these attorneys are typically paid on a flat fee basis. If you are cynical, you will think that they have done this to hide the fact that they've done no work. The remarks look longer, look how much text there is, but really this doesn't take a whole lot of attorney time. It certainly doesn't take much thought. The strategy I prefer is arguing minimally. Again, this is really considered as effectively. And here we're going to direct the examiner's attention to only the important parts of the claim, the references, and the distinctions between them. The remarks section is going to include only the relevant portions of the claim. I'm not going to paste the entire claim in. I'm also going to do more than include than just the amended portion, usually, not always, but usually, because there's some context set forth elsewhere in the claim that I'm trying to um, create relationships to. Here, the remarks sections are still typically very short, maybe 3 to 5 pages. It's very minimal estoppel, especially if we are quoting the references, which is what I strongly recommend. But the difference is the examiner's response. They think, look, this is useful. This is different information. I can reconsider my position. And as far as the cynical view of attorney compensation goes, because you're really trying to focus on overcoming the rejection, which is professional behavior, it's usually not too relevant whether the attorney is compensated based on an hourly or a flat fee basis. That doesn't mean it's completely irrelevant, right? If I have an applicant that's paying me more per response than average, I'm going to take more time to really explain this to the examiner. That's absolutely true. And similarly, if I have an applicant that, like applicants are welcome to choose whatever price level they want. If they demand a lower than average um, rate, then I'm still going to try to do this. I'm still going to argue minimally, but I'm not going to really develop the arguments as much as I might have otherwise. Right. It's going to be more like, look, I'm going to focus more on what the examiner has or doesn't have. I'm not really going to provide as much explanation as you'll see in today's example. So let's get into it. This is the case study. This is today's example. This is a machine learning device for creating a database to improve accuracy. We're really not going to focus too much on the technical side of this. Um, the reason is that, well, there's two reasons. One is that, I'm giving you a highlights version of this case. What I hope that my viewers do is sit down, maybe have a kid, meet some of your friends, watch the video, study the case, discuss it. Um, really try to rework this office action and see how you can come up with the same answer. But on the other side is the fact that for some people, this is all they're going to do. So I have to kind of introduce just enough um, that you can, kind of follow what's going on so that you can really appreciate what's going on underneath. So this invention relates to image processing using machine learning to detect an object like cancer cells in an image. And in the related art, it is impossible to create a learning image database capable of continuously improving the identification accuracy of the classifier. Okay. This is not about, this is not directly about um, a more accurate identification. It's about how you create the database that eventually results in a more accurate identification. Uh, for our English viewers, our English speaking viewers, the English will follow the Japanese. This is the Japanese version of the flow chart of figure 10. It's been modified slightly to fit on this slide. You can see that I didn't connect this arrow here. We're not going to walk through it other than to point out that the claimed features are really focused on this on the right side here. And these are color coded for the for reference to the claim coming up soon. So you can see what how the claim is reflected in this figure. Here's the same flow chart in English. Again, you can see that there's these two determinations. The learning image database is updated, and you can see that there are many steps that are not really present in the claim at all. The office action that we're considering today is the non-final of April 18th, 2025, in which claims 1 through 15 are rejected as unpatentable over Matsumoto in view of Nobusuke. I don't know why the examiner referred to Nobusuke by his first name, but I need to use the same name that the examiner uses so that there's some consistency between the seminar and the office action. This is the amended claim. I have retyped it. So if there's any typographical errors, that's my fault. But you can see one of the things I added were these European style references. Please don't do this in your actual US responses. This is purely so that you can understand this case. Um, so we can have these like, color-coded portions and explanations. This is not in the actual claim. This just should not be in your actual claim. This is not present in my claim, other than for the purposes of this seminar. Two things I do want to point out is that there is a determination here, and then there's this on a condition that the second average detection rate is greater than both the first average detection rate and the threshold. There's this these two operate together in the invention, and there's this phrase down here that says, it determines at least one learning database among the first learning database and the second learning database, and at least one classifier to be updated. And then down here it has the updating. I would not have worded it this way. I think that a skillful examiner can slice the claim at these locations and reject it. Um, for that reason, I think that this claim was probably not drafted in America, but that's kind of the point today, is that, I'm assuming that, if I were the applicant's attorney, that they would send me the same claim and I would have to present arguments for this. So yeah, this isn't the way I would draft the claim. Um, but that's fine. Some applicants don't want me to draft the claim. Maybe they want it for some other reason, like consistency with a European case or a Japanese case or whatever it is. So what are the applicant's remarks? These are, screen captures of the remarks. First, they summarize the rejection, and then they set forth unedited claim one. There is no additional information relative to the claim listing here. It's just straight up the exact, well, it's not because it's cleaned up, but it's the exact same meaning of the claim as set forth earlier in their office action response. They haven't edited it to focus on anything in particular. And then they walk through a summary of figure 10. There's three things I'd like to point out here. The first one is that this is not focused on any particular inventive aspects. There's a lot of material here that refers to things that don't contribute to the inventive features. This is also not focused on the claim features. There's a lot of this flowchart or this explanation that is not set forth anywhere in the claim as far as I could understand it. Um, and therefore, there's also no focus on the amendment support. I can't look at this and say, oh, this is the portion that clearly supports the claim amendments, and therefore that's why this is useful. This is really, as far as I can tell, this is really just a summary of the flowchart in its entirety. And you can see there's a lot of quotes. There is some underlining, I guess, to help it make it easy for someone, but I really couldn't understand what the significance of the underlining is. I don't know if it relates to inventiveness, claim distinctions, claim support. I honestly couldn't tell. And then they set forth this unedited advantage. The real concern here is that this is not at all particular to the claim features. These actually relate to features that are not in the claim. It's not completely removed from the claim, but a lot of what they're describing here is not set forth in the claim. And so I don't think it'll be very persuasive. They then include figure 10 in its entirety. Again, this is a great example of arguing only the record, right? We talked about what's in the specification. Specification's already in the record. Here's figure 10 in its entirety. Same issue as the summary of this flow chart, right? There's no focus on the inventive aspects, right? A lot of the inventive aspects are over here on this left side of the figure. If you actually track what the applicant argues against the claim, against the disclosure. These aren't particular to the claim features. Again, the claim features are over here. We know from our color coding in this lower right portion, but we've got all this other stuff in here for some reason. And nor is it particular to the amendment support. Again, the amendment support's mostly focused in the lower right section. They then set forth their arguments. I'm really not going to spend too much time today reading out from either their actual remarks or my alternative ones. But I do want to read this. It says, instead, the incited references of record are silent with respect to the combination of features in amended Claim 1. This is what I mean by general allegation of patentability. Okay, this is textbook arguing only the record. Right? They set forth all of this stuff that's already on the record. There's no additional explanation. Their arguments do not identify any specific claim language overcoming the rejection. In fact, you can see they don't even talk about the claim at all. They also do not explain how the amended claim distinguishes over Matsumoto or Nobusuke. They just say, well, they're silent. It's a great strategy if it works. Therefore, our applicant has presented about 4.5 pages of content that's already of record. Like I said, this is just arguing the record. The applicant argued nothing about the examiner's references, literally 0 sentences. Also 0 sentences about the claim. And therefore the examiner learns nothing by reading the applicant's remarks. Well, I don't know what they're even supposed to learn here. That some unclaimed embodiments are inventive. Um, Unsurprisingly, a final rejection issued on October 16th, 2025, maintaining the same rejection. The examiner, and again, I do want to call it this. This is all the um, examiner gave back. I mean, the examiner updated their rejection, his rejection, but in terms of like what the real response is to the applicant's arguments, the examiner gives back basically the same thing that the applicant gave him, which is that contending that a combination of Matsumoto and Nobusuke continue to read on the claims as presently drafted. The examiner contends that at least the elements of Matsumoto figures 8 through 10 and their relevant explanations continue to read on aspects of the current drafting of the limitations. This is basically the examiner equivalent of a blanket, of a general allegation of patentability. It's a general allegation of unpatentability. Not very effective, big waste of applicants' resources. So let's look at me, how I would respond to this non-final office action, the previous one. Well, here's the summary of the rejection. I do include this portion that's the closest dependent claims. I'm calling out that claims 2 through 4 and 12 through 14 have been incorporated, or features related to those have been incorporated. We'll talk more about that on the coming slides. And then I'm going to set forth claim 1 in a very edited fashion. I include these first two portions for context. Again, we'll talk about what I'm trying to achieve here in a moment. And I'm also going to include the argued features at the bottom of the claim here. Okay. This is the part that I'm actually going to argue. What do I mean by summary of the rejection? Well, what I'm going to do is list all of the relevant rejections. Okay. So I apologize. This slide was not drafted well. Let's pretend I'm talking about a different case for a moment. Let's say claim one is rejected over the Trump reference. Um, and claim two is rejected over Trump in view of the Nani Nani reference. In this situation, when I go to amend claim one to include claim two, I'm going to include not just the rejection of claim one rejected over Trump, but I'm also going to say claim two is rejected over Trump in view of Nani Nani. Let's say there's a third reference, and now it's, for claim three, and claim three is rejected over Trump in view of Nani Nani and Smith. If I'm not touching claim three, if I'm not amending claim one to include claim three, I'm also not going to include the rejection of claim three in this section. I do not want to list every rejection because it distracts the examiner's attention. I'm showing the examiner all of the relevant rejections. I am not showing the examiner any of the irrelevant rejections. The amendment is to include claim two and claim one. I'm going to include the rejection of claim two in this description. I am not going to include the rejection of claim three. All right, back to this case because it includes claims two and three. Why am I including these closest dependent claims? A rejection of a similar dependent claim identifies where the examiner previously found these types of features in the references. Okay. It helps my examiner understand, like, hey, here's where you really need to be focusing your attention. There's an additional benefit of helping to identify support for the claim amendments. Um, this isn't really, this isn't always sufficient. But it does tend to show some support. The goal here is that the dependent claims are typically shorter than the independent claims, not always, but usually. And the same is true of the office action itself. And so if I can point to a 13-line rejection of claim four in this office action, these are the actual lengths in the office action, by the way. That's a lot more efficient than pointing to the 33-line rejection of claim one, right? If I say claim one has been amended and I don't explain uh, the source of these amendments, the examiner has to work through the entire 33-line rejection of claim one to understand what's different. If I say, hey, Mr. Examiner, we've amended claim one to include claim four, he knows that he doesn't have to look through this 33-line rejection. He can go directly to the 13-line rejection of claim four, saves him a lot of time. The context, let's talk about what I mean there. These are the portions establishing something like antecedent basis for the argued features. This is antecedent basis poi. Um, it's not quite antecedent basis. We'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. But what I'm trying to show you is what this looks like. So, later on in the claim, we're going to talk about the creation of classifiers. I want to remind the examiner that this isn't just that the classifiers aren't just created, but they're actually created based on this average detection rate. When I showed you the claim, I pointed out these two portions that have this determination in the condition. Again, there's a portion that says to be updated and then an updating. I also showed you when we looked at the claim that it could have been worded better for US practice on these last two examples here. But that's fine, right? Again, maybe the applicant wants the claim worded this way. Maybe it's a targeted prosecution. They've got an infringer. I know that this could be a problem in the prosecution. I'm going to include them because I want to do my best job to present the applicant's claim the way they want. If I have time or if an authorization from my applicant, maybe I'm adding a new dependent claim to clarify how these relate to each other. There's a lot of high level U.S. attorney analysis going on here. And the inclusion of this context is my way to try to bridge the gap for the examiner. I'm trying to make the best argument I can for my applicant because they believe that these are already connected in the claim, even if I, in my professional capacity, think otherwise. So this is that antecedent basis part I was kind of talking about. Um, Literal antecedent basis, like the. This is often a part of the context. It's not just this, though, right? Again, the claim requires more than just determining a classifier to be updated. The classifier that's updated must be one created based on average detection rates. This is actually in the claim for sure. Okay, this isn't, hey, my applicant believes it is. This is one that I actually believe is in here. I cannot stress enough that this simple looking issue is deep enough to be its own seminar. In my view, the average US patent attorney is unable to make this argument. There's, I don't want to get too into it because it could be an hour of time. The short version is that when we begin our careers, we don't really understand why this doesn't work because our claim interpretation is not sufficient to understand when it should work and when it shouldn't. We get a lot of rejections from the examiners attacking our positions, such that some are correct that that is not actually, the argued features are not actually recited in the claim. And some are incorrect because they are recited in the claim. And it takes a lot of attorney introspection and attention to detail over many years to kind of sort out like, hey, this examiner was right, this examiner was wrong, what was actually in my claim, stuff like this. The reason I'm saying that I don't think the average US patent attorney can make this argument is that even a lot of really good US patent attorneys do not believe that this is an effective argument because it doesn't because they can't discern when the examiner is correct and when the examiner is incorrect about the response to this argument. I'm telling you, it could be like an hour. So anyway, so the important part for you, you viewers, is go ahead and put this stuff in the claim. Like go ahead and put it in your remarks. Show the examiner what the claim means. If you don't, then they're going to kind of ignore that. A lot of examiners do that in the office sections. They'll just rely on a reference for teaching a classifier to be updated, and the representative, need to say, no, it's not just a classifier. It's got to be a special one based on average detection rates. Kind of the counterweight to including these features is that nothing more than the context or the argued features. I really don't want to include the full length of the claim because it distracts my examiner's attention. My examiner just needs to focus on whether or not they need new references. Okay, let's continue with the response. Again, the English will follow the Japanese, thanks to the preview window in Microsoft PowerPoint. So up here, I am not explicitly arguing against combining embodiments. Basically, I'm saying that, look, uh, the office action relied on the second embodiment of Matsumoto in rejecting claims 1 and 3. But then when you get to claim 4, it's the fourth embodiment. I'm really not arguing against that. I'm just acknowledging the facts. Okay. Why? Um, Supervisory examiners often do not review their junior examiners' non-final office actions. But when it comes time for a final office action, they will look at the applicant's remarks first. And so this comment is actually not directed to my examiner, though it should be. I mean, obviously my examiner should look at this and reconsider, but really I'm including it for the supervisor's potential review. I don't know that this is going to actually be reviewed. But I'm hoping that it is. And I'm hoping, or I'm hoping that my examiner sees this and reconsiders their position and says, oh, look, I'm combining embodiments. Are there references where you can combine embodiments? Absolutely. Is Matsumoto one of those? I don't believe it is. I don't believe that you can properly combine embodiments in Matsumoto. I'm not arguing against it because I don't want to make my examiner upset. I don't want to appear unprofessional in front of the supervisor. I'm just going to point this out, and hopefully, if my examiner gives back, intends to send out a final office action, and the supervisor looks at my remarks, I think the supervisor is going to look at uh, the office action in Matsumoto and say, look, maybe you shouldn't be doing this here. This comment, my point is that this comment alone might be sufficient to get a different rejection. Why am I including this portion? The examiner relied on this portion of Matsumoto, but did not seem to understand it. So I'm trying to set forth, hey, look, this is what Matsumoto is really doing here. Um, I'm not really arguing it. I'm just kind of explaining, like, look, this is what Matsumoto does. Here I am setting forth figure 13 of Matsumoto with some additional comments. Um, we don't want to copy what's in Matsumoto. That would be arguing the record. That's not really useful. But we're going to supplement it to enhance the examiner's understanding, right? He probably already looked at figure 13 once. He probably didn't understand it. We're going to kind of add these comments here to help clarify, like, hey, look, when Matsumoto talks about these things, this is where it is. Um, and therefore try to supplement the existing information in a way that can improve our examiner's understanding. Matsumoto is terribly written in English. I have to imagine it's just as bad in Japanese. Um, I really had to edit these quotes here to make sense for my examiner. The point, of course, is that because there are quotes, there is very minimal estoppel present. And so, I'm trying to make it easy for my examiner to understand what Matsumoto is, in fact, teaching, but I don't want to do it at the expense of my applicant, right? I don't want to hurt my applicant and by creating estoppel, by making acknowledgments about things that are not actually recited or disclosed by Matsumoto. This is a very conservative approach, but also really helping my examiner, understand what is in this reference that they've applied. In this portion, I am not quoting. I've rephrased it. The reason is that this explanation required just too many modifications, right? There's too many ellipses and brackets, and for the number of words that I actually want, I'm going to break my rule about quoting, so I can just set it forth in plain language. It just looks a lot cleaner, right? In English, it just says, look, the data AB is adopted as evaluation data. So clear, so straightforward. If you look at this citation, you'll see that it would have been a mess to say this. We're going to come back to this slide in a moment. But Matsumoto actually does not explain steps S37 and S39. What happens is you get to paragraph 226, and it says these operations S37 and S39 are similar to these prior steps described in paragraph 134. I'm going to actually make this substitution for my examiner so my examiner can see exactly what Matsumoto is saying, even if Matsumoto doesn't itself explicitly describe it, right? This is an extra step. This is new information that is in Matsumoto. Here's my substantive arguments. Um, Here's the kind of the way I do it. So first, I identify the Matsumoto structures that are similar to our own or similar to our claim. so that the examiner has some idea what is the most relevant portion of Matsumoto, at least in our opinion, my opinion. And then I'm also going to include this green portion. This is the claim language itself. And to help the examiner see the logic to get from this portion in purple to this green portion, I'm going to identify specifically what Matsumoto lacks relative to our claim. Okay. And when I do this, I'm going to use phrases that are in our claim that are not necessarily they shouldn't be in Matsumoto, right? That's the patentable distinction. Um, and so my examiner understands, like, look, this is what Matsumoto does have, this is what Matsumoto doesn't have, and this is kind of like how I know that Matsumoto doesn't have these. It would have to have these features if I were to disclose our reference. So it's a lot easier if I do this in English for me, obviously. So for example, when I get to this portion, I'm using claim language, right? I'm using phrases like at least one classifier, toka, on a condition, toka, average detection rate, toka, threshold. All of these words appear here in this green portion so that my examiner can understand, hey, not only are these distinctions, but this is actually where they appear in the claim. This is how they're claimed. And when I do that, I'm going to edit the previous claim language, right? So this is even less for my examiner to consider. This is really, really focused on the patentable distinctions of the claim over Matsumoto. And actually, I do want to call out one more thing. I have this subtle inclusion of the fourth embodiment here, right? I'm trying to remind the examiner that, hey, you should only look at one embodiment. I'm not arguing with my examiner. I'm not saying it's inappropriate. I'm just saying, like, hey, we're doing that. All right, that's Matsumoto. Now we have to do Nobusuke. So what I'm doing here is just trying to summarize it for my examiner. I don't want to repeat the same subject matter from the reference, right? A lot of references have like, functional block diagram and then they have a flow chart and like, it's not the exact same words, but they're described very similarly. Unless there's something different that you need to include both of them, just set it forth once. Okay. Here it looks like I've focused on the functional block diagram. If my examiner wants to look at the flowchart, he can. I don't need to waste his time forcing him to look at the flowchart if I'm already arguing the functional block portion. Okay. Like just give it to them in the shortest amount that you can communicate your ideas to them. I really couldn't. I don't think the examiner's explanation tracks Nobusuke's disclosure. I I didn't really think he has it at all. But here, what we're trying to do is trying to say, like, look, okay, this is what you're saying Nobusuke says, and I'm not really saying it has it or doesn't because I don't understand why he thinks this is relevant. Um, but even if this is relevant, I'm trying to explain what we don't what Nobusuke doesn't have. And again, I'm trying to do it in the context of bridging the gap from what Nobusuke, you know, whatever the examiner thinks is relevant in Nobusuke to our actual claim language. I'm going to use phrases from our claim, updating a recognizer database, up and updating the database to average detection rates, threshold. It should be clear. Brian, is this typical of your work? No. Oh my gosh, no. The arguments in this seminar are exceptionally long, especially regarding Matsumoto. This is, I usually put in like two or three sentences about a reference, okay? But this is, I don't know what case, I don't pick and choose my cases the way that, people might be tempted to, right? I just choose a case, I do it, and I do like these case studies. I don't know what I'm going to find. This one really required extensive arguments, um, in my view. So these are long. I apologize. But the why I'm doing it is Matsumoto is almost impossible to understand. I spent hours trying to understand that reference. And the examiner's reliance on the Nobusuke machine translation, because Nobusuke is a machine translation, this is not great either. It's I'm sure the examiner has no idea what's in these references or what's missing in these references. So it's our job to explain it to the examiner. I wish I could have explained it in a lot fewer uh, sentences. So what's the contrast between what the applicant did and what we did? Well, the applicant spent 3.5 pages explaining their invention. That's not very consistent with US practice. We spent literally 0 sentences explaining the invention. That's typical of US practice, right? We don't really care so much about what's invented. We care about what's not in the references. The applicant spent 5 lines generally alleging patentability. Right. We read 2 of them, but if you count the whole paragraph, it's 5 lines. We spent 1.5 pages explaining Matsumoto, with a clearer explanation than in the reference itself, right? That's why we're doing it, is not because we think that the examiner uh because we're trying to punish ourselves or something, or trying to make it look like we're doing work. We're doing it because it's clear that the examiner does not understand what's in Matsumoto. We have to make this clearer if we're going to distinguish over it. And then we spent about 3/4 of a page explaining Nobusuke. I actually wrote up these arguments before I pasted them into the PowerPoint. So these are the actual lengths. These are not the PowerPoint lengths. Results. Well, obviously, I cannot tell you my arguments or be persuasive. I am not the applicant's attorney. I can't call up the examiner and be like, hey, here's these arguments. What do you think about these? Um, but I can argue to you that I think why they'd be persuasive. So the first point I want to make is that in the non-final office action, the examiner applies the second and fourth embodiments of Matsumoto. In the final office action, the examiner applies the third and fourth embodiments. If I'm the examiner supervisor, am I going to allow my examiner to do that? Probably not. Um, I probably won't even let him combine these embodiments, um, let alone change from the second to the third. Choose one and stick with it would be my advice. Because that's the way Matsumoto works. Again, some references you can combine. Matsumoto, I don't think is one of them. I'd say stick if you don't have it in one of these embodiments, go get another reference because that's really what you're trying to do here anyway. I don't look at much like when I do these cases, I don't know what I'm going to see when I open them. I also start at the beginning. I don't switch to the final office action and then try to add in extra stuff for the non-final. I really do these in chronological order. There's a lot of videos making that point. Um, we actually argued this updating of Matsumoto Figure 13 in our remarks, but the final office action, which of course hasn't seen our arguments, relied on that. So I think that the examiner would hesitate at least before relying on this when we've already got remarks on the record directed to it. Um, this slide is if you're just watching this and you have no intention of working this case, this slide's going to be a little too detailed for you. But again, some of my applicants, I'm hoping, are not applicants, my viewers. Sorry, guys. Some of my viewers are actually working this case and having group discussions about it. And this slide is for you guys. Um, if you look at the actual embodiment, Matsumoto third embodiment, that is closer to the claim subject matter. That's better than the second embodiment in the non-final office section. And so, how do I know that my arguments directed to the second embodiment would also apply to prevent my examiner from relying on the third embodiment in the final office action? Well, here's why. So the final office action didn't use steps S18 and S20 of the third embodiment. Okay. Um, So he's not really relying on it for that portion, which is closer. And then if I told you there's that slide, right, where we submitted, or we replaced S18 and S20 with S37 and S39. That was slide 46. Um, if we've already presented those arguments, I don't think he's going to use that portion of the fourth embodiment, right? So he doesn't have it in the third embodiment. He doesn't have it in the fourth embodiment. So why is he going to try to use Matsumoto instead of finding a new reference? I think he's just going to go get a new reference instead, or allow the case ideally. So did we achieve our goals, right? At the beginning, I asked, I told you there's three goals of our remarks. So did we explain the references to the examiner? Yes, because it's clear to me that the examiner does not understand what's actually in Matsumoto or Nobusuke. Did we do it in a time efficient manner? Yes. Again, I typed up these actual remarks. They are 2.25 pages. The applicant spent 3.5 pages. It is more efficient than what was actually submitted to the examiner by more than a full page. It's more like 33%. Um, I can't prove to you that the examiner is convinced that the current rejection cannot be maintained, but I think it's very clear actually that it can't be. I would be shocked if the examiner maintained this rejection, the non-final. So when I was doing this seminar, I thought that, this is a live case, and I wanted to get my remarks in front of, I wanted to get the seminar in front of some of my attendees before the January due date. I guess that must have been the 3-month date for this final rejection because we're already past the 2-month date. And so, if you're really interested, you can see my time-stamped emails that include all of the previous information. The point that I'm making is that the applicant filed a response on February 6th after I completed my seminar. So this is all new information to me that is not in my original seminar. Let's see what they did. So this is the newly amended claim. You can see they are taking out some portions here, but generally they're narrowing it rather substantially. I mean, of course, that's the point, right? Is you don't want to broaden the claim if you have a rejection. You're going to try to narrow it. Um, they've got this the really narrowing part's kind of over here in this updating portion at the end of the claim. This is a great time to talk about the interest payments on prosecution debt, right? This is a theme that's been going on for about 9 months in terms of my seminars. I've been working on the idea for more than a year, though. Uh, the first interest payment on the prosecution debt is the financial cost itself, right? Um, it is going to, this response might have taken, well, it definitely took an extra response to catch up to where, assuming my remarks would have been persuasive, there's an extra office action here. So we could have skipped this final office action, perhaps. Um, so there's a service fee for this after final amendment. Um, Arguably, maybe it's not. You don't have to believe this part. That's not really the focus of this slide anyway. But there's definitely an RCE that costs $1,500. Filing remarks. If you took my remarks and submitted after the final office action, they still should have worked. They would not have required an RCE. We definitely wouldn't have incurred a first month extension of time because, again, mine was submitted to some of my attendees ahead of the 3-month date. So these are real costs to the applicant that would not have been incurred had they followed my strategy. Possibly this after final amendment too, depending on how prosecution goes. There's also a big cost here, the narrowed claim scope. The new claim recites these sets of classifier parameters. It includes this phrase, exclude remaining first classifiers from updating. Oh man, oh, every patent attorney that's written an invalidity opinion is like excited to see that phrase. Oh, that looks so good. That's real. We're gonna if I'm not the patentee here, I'm really gonna limit their claim scope with that. And there's also a lot of significant changes to this last operation, this updating portion that I pointed to. The point is that there's a big cost here as well. This is a huge interest payment on the prosecution debt. The resulting patent now is much narrower. Of course, there's any prosecution disclaimer estoppel from any additional arguments presented in this response. But actually, the whole point of me talking about these interest payments is the personnel cost, because I think that this gets overlooked in a lot of by every patent attorney I've ever seen speak, regardless of country of origin. But when we go out drinking, company employees, kaishain, um, the patent attorneys, the Benrishi themselves, always complain to me, Brian, why is my job so hard? Here is why. This is why. This is the cultural distinction of Japan that plays out in the form of difficult work conditions. It's the stress that accumulated during the response to the final office action that would not have been present had you had a different attorney working the case. Where is that? Show me, Brian. I want to believe you. There was a missed 2 month deadline, right? Current US best practices are filing a response within 2 months of the final office action. That means that probably the docketing software told you that there's a 2 month deadline. There's emails, hopefully, from your US attorney about the 2 month deadline. There's probably discussions internal to your organization about the 2 month deadline. They're all wasted. You missed the deadline. There's a 3 month deadline. Again, emails, docketing reminders, people probably having meetings, staying late on a Friday night, working on the weekends, whatever it is to meet the 3 month deadline, you missed that as well. There's the stress from the inefficient use of financial resources. The Kaisha-in isn't paying $1,500 of their own money. The company is. So, but that's the added stress, right? There's a budget that they're trying to achieve. There's corporate goals that they're trying to achieve. This inefficient use of financial resources, like when you get yelled at for exceeding your budget, this is why. This is why you got yelled at, is not because your U.S. attorney was expensive, but because the U.S. attorney you selected incurred additional costs that weren't necessary. And the point that I'm really trying to drive home here is that all this time that's spent on emails or meetings and their urgency, right? It's not just, um, hey, I have to respond to this email. It's, I need a response to this email tomorrow. This is why you guys end up working late. This is why your jobs are so difficult, because you're paying the interest on the prosecution debt of selecting this other attorney. So what does the applicant do here? Well, the first slide, again, these are the screen caps of their actual response. Nothing new on the first page. I mean, of course, the claim is different, but in terms of their strategy, this is identical. Paste in the whole claim. Second page, I went sentence by sentence. Yeah, there's some small changes. I don't know if I think the underlining changes as well. But basically, this is the exact same as the last set of remarks. The only new portion is this highlighted text at the bottom. You can see this page is about like 90% the same. Same thing on the next page. Most of this is old. Now they've got some new portions. I mean, they should have new portions, right? They changed the scope of the claim. Some underlining. I still don't really understand. This one was a little bit clearer, but I still couldn't really get what the significance of this underlining is trying to achieve. That slide's about 60% the same. This one's probably about the same. Maybe this is 80% the same. Again, this is the only new content. You can read it and let me know if you think what you think. Oh, Hisashibori figure 10. It's the same figure 10. Again, no relationship to anything. Just kind of like, why not put in all the figures? They did update their arguments, though, and I do want to discuss those, though. but they did it in a very inefficient manner. So they begin by talking about these deficiencies in Matsumoto. This is fine, except that I don't really understand how this is reflected in the claim. So I don't know why we're talking about them. Maybe these aren't in the claim. Maybe aspects of this aren't in the claim. Probably they're not all in the claim. Then we get to Nobusuke, and these are different. Okay, so there's the same problem of not saying what Nobusuke has or is lacking that is in the claim. But they also don't use the same words as in Matsumoto. So there's no real relation. Like if I read what's lacking in Matsumoto and then I read what's lacking in Nobusuke, I really don't have a cohesive understanding of what's missing in both references. Well, that's okay because they then tell you what's missing in the combined references. But this is different also. These phrases aren't in. I don't understand how these combined deficiencies are expressed in Nobusuke. I don't understand how these combined deficiencies are lacking in Matsumoto. I also don't understand what claim language distinguishes over the combination of references. I don't know how to get from this blue portion to the claim. I don't know how to get from the green portion to the claim. I don't know how to get from the red portion to the claim. I do not understand these arguments, and I don't think the examiner will either. Um, I also want to call out this one sentence because this just drove me crazy. Uh, it says that the office action impermissibly generalizes the cited references beyond their teachings. I literally don't know what that means. I mean, I know what it means, but I don't know what that has to do with this case. You can definitely generalize cited references beyond their teachings. Well, not beyond their teachings necessarily, but you can definitely generalize references. They do it all the time. And a lot of the time it's correct. But I don't understand how it's impermissibly done beyond their teachings here. I don't think that this really has anything has any relationship to the actual rejection, or if it does, how it relates. I don't think it necessarily relates to the claim. I don't know what this means. Like, what do you mean it impermissibly generalizes the cited references beyond their teachings? I think this is just another general allegation of patentability, just like we have up here. Um, you can say hindsight reconstruction all you want. It doesn't mean anything. Uh, this doesn't mean that this response will be ineffective. I think the arguments are ineffective. I'm sure the arguments are ineffective, but it doesn't mean the response is ineffective, right? Because you've substantially changed the claim. The examiner might allow the case. The examiner might give them a new rejection on totally different art this time. The examiner might give them the exact same rejection. I really don't know. It's a live case. But I can tell you that this is not really going to change the examiner's opinion one way or the other because the examiner doesn't understand any similarities between the red and green portion. The examiner doesn't understand if the blue portion represents those relationships. The examiner doesn't understand how the blue portion relates to the claim, or at least that's my belief. Um, so here's what we covered today. We talked about attorney argument styles. Um, we did the case study. We looked at the applicant's arguments. We looked at my alternative, and then we also looked at the newly added amendment from the applicant. If you have any questions, you can reach me. I'm Brian Epstein. The translation was very graciously provided by Nakayama Yukiko-san of U English Corporation. では、ありがとうございます。終わりました。